Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 31, Karanthian Welcome. In the city-state of Karanth, Indira, lord of the Holy Order of the Sun and ruler of the territory, had called council with his neighbours. He was a tall man, built like a warhorse and looking like a vision from the gods. His neighbours came close to matching him. Jaran was the ruler of the interlocking city-state Fallon. He was lord of the Holy Order of the Twin Moons and showed a mixture of their pleasure in his features. His hair was the dusky orange of the first moon during harvest, and his eyes were the pale amber of the second moon in winter. His skin reflected the seasons, pale but gleaming with health, and he was strong, far stronger than he looked. Madranos was his opposite. Madranos ruled the city-state of Grathan and was lord of the Order of the Phoenix Rising. He was bronze of skin, and his hair was black, but his eyes were the blue of deep afternoon. He was less strong than quick, although it was said he could run for miles and fight beyond the endurance of an ordinary man. The last lord was as striking as the others. Her name was Lanira. She was tall and lithe, the grace of her movements belying the power of her body. Her hair was the brown of fertile earth, and her eyes shone with a swirling mix of blues and greens and browns. She was the Lord of Kerval, the leader of the Order of the Flying Lynx. She wore an armoured breastplate over her simple gown, and the gleam of greaves could be seen through the splits in her skirt that came to just above her knees. It was not her battle armour, just a sign of her office. It was no more than what the others wore. As for weapons, they all wore those, dress blades that were lethal just the same. Those blades rested at peace at their owners' sides as the knights leaned toward each other across the table. Earth weirds, you say? Indira was intrigued. No, Madranos, we've suffered no such invasion here. They aren't coming from the swamp, are they? Nay, Lord. The soft denial drew raised eyebrows from Indira and Madranos, and they looked toward the younger knight, Jaran. The solemn look on his face was echoed in his voice. I'd say they came from the mountain. They're crossing more often into my southern realms. I've lost at least one patrol to them, and another one has gone missing. Saw one myself 2 days ago, like a great snake of earth or mire, some 10 to 12 feet long, and that's not all. There are creatures of air as well. This time it was Lanira who interrupted. They're some kind of elemental, but warped beyond the bounds of natural growth and evil in intent and deed. I almost lost a wing of riders when the first one struck. And the fisherman. She let her words trail off as Madranos drew a breath. Seeing her wait for him, he spoke. My fishermen, too, report being attacked by water snakes that smell of rot and decay. They were all silent for a moment, staring into each other's eyes. The river flows from the mountains, Indira said after a little thought. Perhaps we should send a joint force? Or several, Madranos muttered darkly. Their discussion ended abruptly, the sudden hum of magic causing them to shift their hands to the decorated hilts of their blades. They stood, pushing their seats back as they sought the source of the interference. Magic shimmered in the center of the chamber. Wards hummed their denial. Magic flared in response. Wards appeared to shatter or subside. Magic grew into a silver column in the throne room's center. The lords stepped around the table, blades free and held ready. The column became wider, an archway veiled in silver mist. Someone stepped through, and the lords fell back to give the new arrival room, taking note of the hooded cloak drawn over his head and the black gloves covering his hands. They took note also of the warrior that strode after him and moved further back to allow room for the women he guided through with one arm. One of the women, robed as a wizardess and crowned with fiery red hair, gasped as she entered, and the knights drew back further. Her locks curled and floated around her head in a foxy red-brown mist, lifted in the after-breeze of a magic not entirely related to the portal at her back. Two more figures came through, and the portal snapped closed behind them. Both figures jumped, and the cloak fell away from the smaller figure's face, making Lanira draw a sharp breath and bring her sword to guard. Identify yourselves, Indira commanded, taking note of the young elf's mottled skin, amber eyes, and bright yellow hair. The warrior accompanying the cloaked man laid his hand upon his sword hilt, only to have the cloaked man lay a hand on his arm and shake his head. When he spoke, the cloaked man's voice was too soft for them to discern the words, but the barbarian took his hand from the hilt. Endura heard the trepidation in the man's voice, and tensed slightly. His tension was answered by a straightening of the barbarian's posture, and he stepped slightly clear. Forbidden to draw his blade, the man was still prepared to protect his master. Endura frowned. Who was beneath the cloak to inspire such devotion from a Northlands warrior? Very slowly, the cloaked man removed one of his gloves, revealing the same mottled skin as the child, and causing all the knights to come alert. Unperturbed, the man peeled off his second glove, then tucked both in his belt. Next, ignoring the tension around him, he raised his mottled fingers to the leather thong hanging around his throat, and drew Staravan's holy symbol from beneath his tunic. As the symbol hung free to rest against the man's chest, Endura started to relax. If the man served Staravan, then why the caution with his looks? The colour of his skin could not possibly matter if he served the god of good and balance. What made him so afraid to show his face? He drew as sharp a breath as the others when the man took the edges of his hood in his slender fingers and flipped the cowl from his face. His hand descended to his sword as swiftly as the others, too. 'Twas no man at all. Kvarag! Madranos spat, leaping toward the newcomer, his blade gleaming with intent. A clang followed as Geron's blade drove Karanth aside. A grunted curse came soon after, as the Knight of the Twin Moons used his body to set the Phoenix Rising Knight off his course. The Kvarag raised his voice, projecting it calmly into the hall. I am Staravan's servant, he announced, called to defeat the Old One, the Lord of the Dark Weirds, and ordered to ask for your aid against him. Endura's outswept arm kept Lanira from taking her blade to the mottled skinned speaker. Listen, he commanded. Staravan does not give his symbols lightly. As if to confirm his words, the newcomer's symbol gleamed softly with an inner light, and Lanira stilled in response. A sideways glance showed Endura his fellow knight was offering a slight prayer to her goddess, Miralay. Knowing she would follow the goddess's direction, he turned his attention to Geron and Mirandos. The pair were evenly matched in height and build, but here the semblance ended. Geron's amber eyes were almost gold, a signal to Mirandos that his brother knight's temper was barely leashed. Listen to Endura, the Twin Moons knight hissed, keeping up the pressure of his blade against Mirandos's. And listen to me. I sense no evil here. Listen. Mirandos's eyes gleamed like sapphires, another warning sign, but one Geron ignored. Instead, he continued to hold the Phoenix Knight's blade at bay, waiting until the blue fire dimmed from his gaze and the knight stepped reluctantly away. Very well, it will be as you say, Mirandos conceded, but don't be surprised if I have no liking for it. Staravan's ill-coloured priest turned his gaze to the Phoenix Knight, his own eyes gleaming with yellow fire, but his voice remained soft as he replied. No one likes it, he said. I was torn from the side of the goddess I'd served for almost 2 decades, and given to another, and that required the loss of all I had earned and the surrender of everything I was working toward. His face softened, and the glow of his eyes diminished. The hard regret in his voice became contentment. I have a new God now, and with him I am content. He lowered his voice. I only pray that he remains content with me, for I have no wish to suffer godly rejection again. Clasping his hands before him, he scanned the knights and focused on Endura. With a wary glance toward the others, he came to a halt before the Lord Knight and knelt, bowing his head. My lord, he began, I have come a long way seeking your aid, and although our journey was shortened by ancient magic, I fear we have not travelled quickly enough. He raised his head. I am glad I am not the only one Staravan has recruited to this battle. Endura sheathed his sword. As he did so, Lanira nodded as if agreeing with an unheard answer, and her expression showed her sudden return to the present. With a curious glance at Raomar, she followed Endura's action, settling her blade in its sheath. Jaren stared at Mirandos for an instant longer before taking his hand from the dark man's shoulder and sheathing his own sword. Mirandos looked once more at Raomar and followed suit. You mentioned a lord of Darkweirds, Endura said, as Raomar rose from his knees. The Kavarag nodded, and Endura gestured for him to follow him to the table set across one end of the room. As he did, he glanced at where the portal had stood, frowning slightly. No magic should have been able to penetrate the palace wards, yet this one had come and gone, and the wards still looked untouched. He shook his head. That was a powerful display of magic, he told Raomar, and the beast elf glanced back to where the gate had been. Endura was sure he saw the man's eyes flicker to the wards just before he nodded in agreement. It was, he said, but it was not mine. That sort of power is beyond me, I'm afraid. A pity, Endura said, then sighed. What sort of aid does Staravan tell you to ask of us? That I do not know, Raomar admitted, but the first thing I will ask for is your assistance in requesting guidance from our mutual lord. Endura stilled, studying him with calm blue eyes, and Raomar met his gaze, unflinching. That is all I can ask, Raomar assured him, save for your hospitality for myself and my companions while you seek your gods on the truth of my words and... Whatever else he was going to say was interrupted by a loud knocking at the doors to the council chamber. Endura signalled Mirandos to open the doors. Still scowling at the elf priest, his fellow lord obeyed. The knocking was repeated, and Mirandos crossed to answer it. Raomar watched as the Lord Knight broke into a run. "All wait," he called as he slid to a stop in front of the doors. "I am coming." The knocking abated, and Raomar heard the restless movement of numerous waiting feet. Ghost crowded closer to Brianda, and the young rogue moved closer to Raomar and Grumor. The barbarian dipped his chin, acknowledging her presence, and they moved Ghost between them, sheltering her with their bodies. There was a sizable gathering beyond those doors. They watched as Mirandos opened the door for those outside, and saw him stiffen with surprise. "My lord and lady high priests! Master sorcerers!" the knight exclaimed. "We're here on urgent business," a woman's voice replied before the knight could ask. "We must speak with Endura and the rest of the Lord Knights immediately. The gods have stated it so." Mirandos looked over his shoulder at Endura, and the Lord Knight nodded his assent. As soon as he had, the Knight of the Phoenix Rising Order swung open the doors. "Then I bid you welcome," he answered. "You are just in time to meet an emissary of the Lord Staravan and his companions." He stood back, holding the door ajar until all those waiting had entered. Endura waited until he had closed it behind the last of them and firmly relocked it against further intrusion. Turning to the gathered priests and mages, he said, "Tell me, what brings you here?" "The gods bade us come," stated Karanth's high priest of Staravan. "They told us of an ancient evil attempting to escape the prison that currently entraps it. They told us of the beast elf's choosing." He turned to survey those already in the room, stopping when his gaze fell on Raomar. Endura beckoned him forward. "Then we have much to discuss," he replied as they approached, "and much on which we must consult the gods."